Okay, we'd like to welcome everyone to this Francisco and Friends talk with Dr. Richard Davidson. Just as a reminder, this is part of the Francisco and Friends series. Many of you have been following us in this series since 2021. We'd like to welcome everyone to this Francisco and Friends talk with Dr. Richard Davidson. Sorry about that, technical glitch. And we are happy to welcome you to this particular talk, which is called Francisco in Love with the World. And this series, as a reminder, honors the 20th anniversary of Francisco Varela's passing and the 30th anniversary of the publication of The Embodied Mind. So we're very happy to welcome Dr. Richard Davidson. I'd just like to introduce him briefly in the beginning before handing it over to Amy Varela, the chair of our board, to guide us through a dialogue this evening. And then we'll open it up to a live Q&A with attendees, and that'll be moderated by our managing director, Gabor Karsai. So Dr. Richard Davidson is the William James and Vilas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he has been a faculty member since 1984. Dr. Davidson is also the founder of Healthy Minds Innovations, which translates science into tools to cultivate and measure well-being. He received his PhD from Harvard University in psychology, psychopathology, and psychophysiology with a minor focus in behavioral neurology and neuroanatomy, and a BS in psychology from New York University. So thank you so much, Richie, for joining us this evening. And I'd like to hand it over to Amy Varela and you for this dialogue, Francisco in Love with the World.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for that. And thank you, Richie, for being here. It's an extraordinary opportunity to talk to someone who is a founding steward of Mind and Life and an innovator in the area of the crossroads between Buddhism and science, and between contemplative thought and science. And you're one of the beginners, and we're really thrilled to have you. I think you'd like to get started, and then maybe we can just let the flow go on from there. Thanks for being here.
That's wonderful, and thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be included as part of this series, and really has given me an opportunity. I love the opportunities that I have to explicitly reflect on and direct my attention to Francisco, and it is always something that nourishes my heart and stimulates my mind, and is really something I treasure. So I really am grateful. And I also want to just express my deepest appreciation to Amy and Gabor for all you guys are doing for Mind and Life Europe. It's really heartening to see, and it is refreshing. And I have the aspiration to participate in Mind and Life Europe activities more as it unfolds in the future. So with that as a little introduction, let me begin by saying that I believe, I don't remember exactly the year, but it was either in 1980 or 1981 that I first met Francisco Varela. And I met him in the laboratory of Roy John, who was a wild neuroscientist in New York City, who is working at NYU Medical School. And Roy John published a very famous paper in Science in 1972 on statistical theories of learning and memory, which I remember the first time I read that paper. I was a first-year graduate student at the time, and it was, one of those papers that had like a visceral impact on me, and it was one of the first efforts to attribute functional significance to dynamic patterns of brain activity measured with both in animals and in humans in that work. And both Francisco and I had independently been attracted to various features of that work. And Roy John gave us the task of working together to come up with an experiment to measure the duration of a perceptual moment. That was my first introduction to Francisco. This was in 1981. This was a full 10 years prior to the publication of The Embodied Mind, and really was the beginning, I think, of Francisco moving in that area and making the transition from his disciplinary origin as a neurobiologist into thinking more globally in terms of complex systems and also the relation between the brain and experience. In those days, I was, as I often have said in public talks, I was a closet meditator. I really began my journey in Buddhism and contemplative science and contemplative practice in 1974. 1974 was after my second year of graduate school, and that was the first time I went to India and sat my first meditation retreat with Goenka. That really began my own personal practice, but I never talked about it to any of my colleagues because I was the subject of a lot of reprimand as a graduate student for even entertaining the thought that I can do research on meditation. And so I think it's, I don't actually think Francisco and I at that time really talked about meditation in any kind of deep way. Mostly I would attribute it to myself in being closed about this because of the perceived inappropriateness that I was led to believe by the mainstream scientific community. And so it wasn't until a full 10 or 11 years after that that I was reconnected to Francisco. And in fact, we spent 3 weeks together, rooming together in at Kashmir Cottage when we were doing this crazy effort to begin data collection with experienced yogis in India. And that was when I really first got to know Francisco. And I will never forget the first evening of that 3-week time together when we all had just arrived in India. And it was a beautiful evening. It was warm. We were all in t-shirts, and Francisco took this really deep breath. And we were just sort of chit-chatting, and it very quickly moved to his description of how important practice had become in his work. And practice meaning his own practice. And I was really still in the earlier stages of my career. And this was before, on this visit, we met with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, on 2 separate occasions. It was really during one of those occasions where I felt that His Holiness not only gave me permission to step out of the closet, but sort of said it was a moral responsibility to step out of the closet and to take this on. And so when that initial first night with Francisco, and then followed by His Holiness the Dalai Lama making this request, which really carried, as I'm sure all of you can imagine, a lot of weight. That really just cracked the whole thing open for me personally, and I just had this extraordinarily deep both appreciation and better understanding of where Francisco was coming from, and the kind of both experiential and intellectual roots that gave rise to the extraordinary body of work that lives on. And, you know, it's also the case that I'm sure all of you know that Francisco's principal teacher was the father of my principal teacher now. And so Mingyur Rinpoche is my meditation teacher and my sort of spiritual guide. He wasn't at that time in 1992 when I first met Francisco, but the fact that this has all come full circle in this way is kind of amazing and very karmic. And for me, just feels like it's completing this mandala that really began with this opening. And I really attribute the very first seed that was planted for my own path was Francisco, and the impact that he had on my own spiritual journey, but also my intellectual journey as a scientist. I'd like to transition now to a few different sort of specific topics that Francisco worked on and really paved the way for, that have expressed themselves in my own work, and also really, I think, have dramatically impacted the field. The first, and probably the most important, I would say, is Francisco's project with a capital P of neurophenomenology. And this, to me, was important in so many different ways. And I really didn't appreciate until I met Francisco really what he meant and the depth of his understanding of neurophenomenology, and what was of particular importance to me, which turned out to have extraordinarily critical impact on so many different aspects of my own career, was the idea that in order to properly do neurophenomenology, we needed to have trained observers who actually were in the practice of training their mind in order for them to be more accurate introspective reporters, if you will. The idea that trained meditators can actually help us discover features of our mind and our brain that otherwise would be opaque to observation was really important, and still is extremely important today. It's led to some novel work and hypotheses, and I should also just tell you all this story because it directly affected the work that we did, and also is directly relevant to Francisco and his impact on this. So we were holding a meeting in Madison, Wisconsin, at the university in October of 2001, with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who was visiting. And Francisco was scheduled to speak and participate in that meeting. And this was a time when Francisco began to become quite ill. And I received a note from Francisco just a little bit before the scheduled meeting date that he was unfortunately not going to be able to attend because of his health. And this was 2001. There was no Skype or Zoom in those days. This was in the days before video conferencing. And we arranged to have a video link set up between the meeting in Madison, and Francisco was in his bed in Paris. And it was at this meeting, and I should say that Francisco was not able to attend because of his health, but he suggested that his student, who was just finishing, and I believe it was his last student, Antoine Lutz, that Antoine attend in his place. And of course, I had not met Antoine personally at that point. And of course, we said we would love to have Antoine represent Francisco's work. And so Antoine took a plane like the next day and came to Madison. And basically, with going home to collect his belongings, stayed for another roughly 10 years. And that was just, first of all, it was an extraordinary gift to have Antoine, who just finished working on his PhD with Francisco, to join our team and bring that tradition to the work. And I cannot overestimate the magnitude of the impact that Antoine had on the work that we did. Antoine was the key scientist in our center who worked on this initial large project with long-term meditation practitioners, and came with the sensibility that was imbued deeply in his core from Francisco. And it was like a direct transmission. And I felt that it was a gift to our center that, I don't think that the work would be had anywhere near the impact that it has turned out, I think, to have, were it not for this kind of amazing karmic happenstance and opportunity. And of course, nothing happens just by chance. And so I really feel this as an extraordinary gift that transpired as a consequence of Francisco's passing, and having this direct transmission through Antoine. And actually, Antoine emailed me earlier today saying that he probably wasn't going to be able to join because he is soloing it with his 2 kids tonight, and right now is cooking dinner for them. So I can just picture Antoine in his classic French way, making a delicious meal for his kids. So if you're listening, Antoine, I love you dearly, and really appreciate everything that you have done and are doing. So back to neurophenomenology. The reason why I was reminded of Antoine is that during Antoine's stay in our center, we began this work in neurophenomenology that was inspired by Francisco, and unfortunately has not yet been published. There's still more work to do to really work this out. But what we discovered in the little bits that we did was just terrifically revealing. And basically, what the essential finding is that we observed is that among long-term meditation practitioners, when you ask such individuals to report on certain features of their mind and look at that report in relation to measures of ongoing brain activity, the correlations that we see in long-term practitioners are much stronger than the associations we see in novice practitioners, largely because we believe the long-term practitioners have learned to more, in a more granular way, inspect their mind and to report on the activity of their mind. Whereas a person off the street who has never been trained to look at their mind is giving you theories about what may be going on in their mind, but not really, if you will, granularly reporting on these activities and processes. And, you know, in many ways, you can liken it to other kinds of expertise. A wine taster can taste elements in a wine that an untutored person is unable to discern because of their training. And here we're talking about refining the lens, if you will, of the mind through contemplative practice. And so this work in neurophenomenology has had a huge impact because it has informed how we can better think about the looking at the relation between the mind and the brain, and of course, you know, Francisco ultimately, I think, ended up in a very radical place on this issue, which I love, and one which I think will hopefully eventually push mainstream science in a different direction. But of course, the radical solution is that when we look at the brain, we're actually looking at the brain through our mind. And so it really, the hard problem becomes a very different problem when you recognize that it is all mediated through the mind. It's a beautiful move, kind of philosophically, that Francisco does. It is not a mainstream move, not one that has been embraced by mainstream neuroscience, but I believe that it will continue to reverberate and push us in healthy ways for many years to come. So that's just a little bit about the project of neurophenomenology and its continuing impact. So there are a couple of other streams that I wanted to specifically mention that Francisco began that also really significantly impacted our own work and also continue to influence the field in many different ways. And let me begin by sharing another story. Probably not a lot of you have heard this story. It's kind of an amazing story. And it goes back to 1992 when Francisco and I and several others, including Cliff Sarin, were together in Dharamsala, India. So His Holiness And we schlepped like 5,000 pounds of instrumentation with us on this trip. And we looked like this ridiculous sort of cross between a bunch of geeks and a traveling rock band. Those days, all of us had much longer hair. And it was just a wild, crazy scene. We had all this equipment spread out all over Kashmir Cottage. And so that was kind of our staging ground. So His Holiness asked us during this visit if we would please give a lecture to the young monks at Nyamgal Monastery to just tell them about what we're doing and sort of talk to them about science. And this was, really the beginning of His Holiness wanting to bring science into the monasteries. And of course, we said we'd be delighted to give this talk. But then after His Holiness invited us, we were sitting around, just Francisco and I and Cliff, talking, and we decided, rather than giving a dry academic lecture, since we brought all this equipment and we weren't really able to use it to test yogis, that's a whole different story. Why not use it as part of this talk? We'll actually give a demonstration. So we'll demonstrate how we can record brain activity and actually show them real time, rather than giving this dry academic lecture. So that's what we decided to do. So in those days, this was 1992, laptops were a lot larger than they are now. Equipment was more clunky. It took much more time to put on electrodes. And so what we decided to do is we're going to put electrodes on one of us and then show them. So Francisco, I forget exactly how we decided this, but Francisco ended up being the subject for that talk. So we put the electrodes on Francisco's head. So it took us about 45 minutes to get all these electrodes on, and this whole big deal, and it just took a long time. And there were about 200 monks dutifully sitting on cushions on the floor. And finally, we got all the equipment set up and we were ready to show them. And we were right in front of Francisco because we were putting on the electrodes. And finally, we were able to part, ways. Diego is saying he has a picture. Great. Well, we can share the picture after I tell the story. So, so we parted ways, and then all the monks just began to laugh hysterically. And we thought that they were laughing because Francisco looked kind of funny with the electrode cap on. But it turned out that they were laughing for a reason that was far more serious than just looking funny. What they were laughing about is that we were talking about compassion, and we were putting electrodes on the head and not on the heart. That's what they were laughing about. And that was, wow, that was like a really big wake-up call. And I think honestly, for all of us, it took us a while to really process this. And just speaking for myself, I would say it took about 20 years to process it fully. Not to say that I fully understand it, but it really took a lot of time. But this is where I think Francisco's work on the embodied mind, on inaction, on the role of the body, is incredibly prescient, visionary, and really paved the way for what the future would hold. And I think that Francisco was really the first person who was read by mainstream cognitive science to bring in the body in this way, in this serious way. And that was an amazing move that I think just helped to open the field in extraordinary ways. And today in the US, there's a book on the bestseller list that's been on the bestseller list for, I think, 82 weeks, called The Body Keeps the Score. And it is a book by Basil van der Kolk, who is I think, a really good guy. He's a psychiatrist that works on post-traumatic stress disorder. And I know him, and I know that he knows Francisco's work, and was influenced by that. And, this is just one of many different data points of how this work has penetrated the culture and opened up whole new areas of research. And in our own work, one of the domains in which this has been the most important is in the study of compassion. And in 1992, there was no such thing as the study of compassion in science. Zero. If you go back to textbooks of psychology or neuroscience in 1992, I very much doubt you would find a single textbook with the word compassion mentioned in the index. And today, it's totally different. And the study of compassion has been both directly and indirectly influenced in really important ways by Francisco's work on the embodied mind. And so let me just share, how we came around to this in our own work with the study of compassion. And this is where, we needed to fast forward many years before we actually started studying the heart directly, since that's what they were telling us to do. And we were so caught in our own ways that we couldn't hear it early on. We were thinking of it more metaphorically, but I'm here to tell you that it's much deeper than metaphor. It's real. It is truly embodied. And so this also gets to inaction. So let me just share a couple of specific data points in our own work with compassion that we began with long-term practitioners. And this was work that Antoine Lutz was directly involved in a major way and led. We discovered a few things. One is that we were able to do cardiac scans where we can actually do MRIs of the heart in addition to the brain. There is a whole field of cardiac functional MR where you can use magnetic resonance imaging methods to look at the functional status of the heart non-invasively. And so it's used by cardiologists and radiologists to interrogate the functional integrity of the heart. And so we used these techniques to look at cardiac activity during compassion training, during compassion meditation, and we looked at measures of coherence between the heart and the brain, and specific parts of the brain that we know to be involved in both descending influence, that is, sending signals to the body, as well as recipients of influence from the body to the brain. And one of the key areas in this kind of work in this kind of process is the insula. The insula is actually the only part of the brain that has what we call a viscerotopic map. That is, different visceral organs are mapped geographically in different regions of the insula. And they are both descending influences as well as ascending pathways. And so what we found is that when long-term practitioners are doing compassion practice, there's a dramatic increase in the synchrony, in the concordance between what's going on in the heart and these visceral areas of the brain. And that, kind of hypothesis really couldn't have, we couldn't have even imagined thinking of this were it not for the precedent that was set by the work by Francisco on embodiment. And I want to also say something about inaction and the role of action more generally, that Francisco also, in a very prescient way, anticipated major developments in cognitive and affective science, thinking about the brain in many ways as an organ of action. One of the things that we found during compassion meditation practice in long-term practitioners, and we saw this very early on, and we had no idea what to do with it until we began thinking about Francisco's work. And that is, we saw strong activation in motor regions of the brain, in somatosensory cortex during compassion. And these practitioners were completely still. They weren't moving. And yet these action areas of the brain were dramatically activated. And I remember the first time we shared this finding with Mingyur Rinpoche. And he said, of course, compassion is preparing us to act. So the moment suffering is encountered, we'll spring into action. It's an action readiness. And so this was really completely unexpected. We had not predicted this. But in retrospect, in thinking about the work of Francisco, and also in consulting with contemplative experts, it really all began to fall into place and to make a lot of sense. There's another stream that I wanted to mention here that also is so deeply connected to embodiment and in action, and that is work on the science of emotion. And here's something quite interesting, because this is an area where I would like to think that we also brought something different to Francisco's repertoire that was not part of his training. Training as both as a neurobiologist and as a cognitive scientist. The serious research on emotion is relatively new, and particularly affective neuroscience is quite new, and cognitive neuroscience really began at least a full 15 years before there was serious affective neuroscience. And so the work on affective neuroscience was, I think, work that Francisco was really just learning about in part through us. And, it's when we think about emotion is non-conceptual and non-propositional to begin with. We certainly, it can be interpreted through propositional thought and conceptual activity, and almost always is. But when you look particularly at the ontogenetic origins of emotion, there's absolutely no doubt that you see emotion exhibited, for example, in a pre-verbal infant before that infant has any capacity for language and for propositional thought in any kind of sophisticated way. Of course, there are elements of cognition that are there at the start, but the affective repertoire is quite robust even at birth. And so I think that this is really an important issue. And I remember, again, very viscerally, the excitement of the opportunity to connect on this domain of emotion. And I think Francisco immediately grasped the relevance of emotion for the project of embodiment. Because emotion, much more than cognition, is embodied. There is no such thing as unembodied emotion. And so it immediately invites the consideration of what role does embodiment play in the experience and expression of emotion. And this, of course, has now become a really vibrant area of research. And one piece that I'd like to just mention, because it brings us back to neurophenomenology in an interesting way, is work that we've been doing, a student of mine has been doing over the last few years, and in many ways is inspired by the work of Francisco. And this is work that we have called coherence between, emotional coherence. And what we mean by that is coherence between a person's reports of their experience and bodily representations of that emotional experience. And it turns out that irrespective of where you fall on a continuum, say, of anxiety or of stress, irrespective of where you fall on that, the closer concordance there is between a person's reports about their emotions and the bodily expression of those emotions, that itself is associated with increased well-being. So to state it another way, people who have a closer coherence between their reports of their experience and the bodily representations of that experience, even if that experience is stress, they are, on average, people who report higher levels of well-being. And we've now replicated that in many different ways and are beginning to look at some of the neural correlates of that. But this is something that, I think harkens back to the Neurophenomenology project and reminds us of the importance of the connection between experience and, in this case, what is going on in the body. And it also, underscores a theme that Francisco was very clear in highlighting, which, in my own career has taken me a while to appreciate just how important this is, and that is putting a premium on experience itself. And that is, a project that still very much is in process in the academy, particularly in the biobehavioral sciences. And this is an area where I think Francisco's work is actually going to grow in importance. And so, it's not often where a scientist passes away and his or her work increases in importance over time. But I actually think that's going to be the case with Francisco. It's going to be like a fine wine that ages, and it will increase its value over time as mainstream science catches up to the insights that Francisco had so early on. So I will end my formal comments there. I'm happy, Amy, if you have specific questions, or we can open it up in whatever ways you suggest.
Thank you so much, Richie. That was absolutely fantastic and fascinating, every minute of it. So I actually don't really have a question. I think we should leave some time for the people who have, I mean, I have lots of questions, but I just wanted to throw out something. So Francisco used to call his meditation cushion his portable laboratory. And I just wondered what you thought of that and what kind of laboratory your cushion is for you in your life.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, for me, I have a very similar relationship to my cushion. I am on my cushion every single day, unless I'm traveling, in which case I'm on another cushion. And it's, you know, it's the most valuable laboratory that I have. And you know, again, Francisco was saying this a long time ago, and I, you know, my appreciation of the extent to which this is true has only grown over time. You know, and I think, and by the way, I think that this is just an incredibly important role that Mind and Life can play both in Europe as well as elsewhere in the world. And that is to underscore the importance that for anyone who is interested in doing science on the mind, having this portable laboratory is not a luxury. It's really, you know, there's no other way to do it, because if it's not done from that perspective, it will constrain the kind of questions that you can ask, and it won't be, you know, meaningful science. So I think that, and I think this is a message that Mind and Life has helped to encourage among particularly young people who are entering the field, and this is so valuable. And I see Antoine just joined.
Yes.
Welcome, Antoine. I was singing your praises earlier, Antoine. Oh, he's still connecting to audio. Okay, I'll say that later.
We'll let him in.
Yeah.
Should be in. Is he in? Is Antoine in?
Yeah, Antoine, welcome. I was singing your praises earlier and talking a lot about time that you were with us in Madison, and particularly at when you first came during the 2001 meeting that Francisco was unable to attend, and His Holiness. One of the things I didn't share earlier is that this was actually when His Holiness said his final goodbye to Francisco over this video link that we had set up. And it was such a poignant, touching moment. I will never forget that moment. And you can feel, even through the ether of the internet, this incredibly deep, palpable connection between Francisco and His Holiness.
Shall we open up for questions, Gabor?
Thank you, Amy. Yes, and thank you so much, Richie. It was such a deep sharing of the key concepts of Francisco's work and your own work, how he shaped your common projects and then your own research. And you mentioned 5 key terms, of course, many more, but those stood out for me: neurophenomenology, embodiment, compassion, emotions, experience, and of course, an action. And we will hear from you more in our upcoming Upaya Varela International Symposium event in the end of May, but we will share more about that later in the end of this talk and also in our upcoming newsletters. I do have a question, and then I will open up for more from the audience. You mentioned in the description of today's talk, in the title of your sharing, Francisco, in love with the world. How do you see that love represented or manifested in your collaboration, and how does that relate to the world at large? How to be in love with the world?
Yeah, I think this is such a profound and deep question. And again, it's one that has evolved for me over time. And I think it was, Amy, you said something beautiful. I think it was in Charlottesville when we were together. I think you said it publicly, about fundamentally Francisco's work was about love. I think that love is about the dissolution of the constructed boundaries which create suffering. I think that in its deepest sense, this is really a lot of what Francisco's work was focused on examining. I, for one, have decided in my own scientific career, as I'm getting up there in years, I made, in 1992, I made the commitment to His Holiness the Dalai Lama that I was going to put compassion on the scientific map. And I've now made the commitment that I'm going to put love on the scientific map, because we shouldn't, scientists have been, that's been like an allergen for scientists to say the word love. It's crazy. I mean, it's so important. And one of the things I'll share is that there are very few political figures that I feel we're blessed to have these days. But we have someone in the United States who is the Surgeon General, who is the Chief Public Health Officer of the United States. And his name is Vivek Murthy. And he originally was the Surgeon General who was appointed by President Obama. And he was fired by the Trump administration. And then he was reappointed by President Biden. And one of the things that Vivek has said, and I got to know Vivek when he was Surgeon General under President Obama. And he's an amazing guy. And he wrote a very beautiful book called Together. And it's a book about compassion and its role in public health. And I highly recommend it. It's really a beautiful book. But he has talked about these times in particular being an epic struggle between love and fear, and where fear contracts awareness and love expands awareness. And there are certain groups today in the world that have become masters at eliciting fear. And the antidote for fear is love. And so I think that we need to do everything we can, operating on all of our cylinders to promote love, because that's really what is, I think, going to be the necessary conditions to preserve humanity as we know it.
Thank you so much, Richie, for answering this question. And I'm now turning to our friends present here. First, I would like to invite Marika van Vugt. I'll turn to everyone who posted the question here, but I will start with Marika. So Marika, if you are here, please share your question or questions.
Hello, Marika. Good to see you wherever you are.
Good to see you too. Yeah, in the Netherlands right now. So thanks so much for that talk and those memories. And it's always good, even if I've heard some stories, to hear them again, because they are, so powerful. So I found your observation that people who subject their own assessments of their subjective state is more in line with their objective state. Those people that they do better, that they feel more well, if I understand that correctly. I found that a very interesting observation. And I was wondering whether you have also causal data. So that is, can people get better at being accurately observing their own mental, physical state, and then do they also start to feel more well? And then a related question about this is, what about this signal? Is there a relationship between, if people fluctuate a lot in their physical state or their mental state, do they feel better or worse? I can see it go both ways. So yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts.
So the second question is about variability. I didn't catch that first word there.
The variability of these, subjective. So rather than the sort of the mean of the signal of people's mental state, whichever one you are measuring, the variability.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So those are wonderful questions, and thank you for both being here and asking them, and thank you for all the great work you're doing. So on the first question, which is really about training, the honest answer is we don't know. I can tell you, and I'm sure you're aware of this, we've done several studies. First of all, let me back up and say that this idea of coherence is not the same, and this is going to get a little technical, and I apologize, but I'll be happy to unpack it. It's not the same as interoception. Interoception is our ability to discern specific physiological processes. So if I'm asked now to perceive my own heartbeat, the accuracy, and there are ways of measuring that, the accuracy of that measurement is my interoceptive ability. When we're talking about coherence in this sense, we're not talking about interoception. It may indirectly relate to interoception. That's something we're studying intensively now, but it's not interoception. And so it is, if I'm, for example, angry, or if I'm sad, or if I'm happy, it's the connection between those emotional states and the accompanying bodily activity that we're talking about. It's not the direct perception of the bodily activity itself. So that's the first thing. We've done now several studies that we published showing that even very long-term meditators are not better, at least on certain tasks, at detecting their own physiological signals directly, interoception. Despite the fact that we had predicted that they would be, the data doesn't seem to support that. although there are limitations of the kind of tasks that have been used. So I think the jury is still out whether this notion of coherence is improved with practice. I would expect that it would be, but we don't have the evidence yet. So that's the first question. The second question, there is this idea in the emotional literature these days of emodiversity. And what emodiversity refers to is the diversity of emotions in a given unit of time, like over the course of a day, that a person displays. And the finding is that people who have more emodiversity have higher levels of well-being. And for me, that's very interesting because one of the great privileges that I've had in my life has been an opportunity to spend quite a bit of time over the last 25 years around His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And and as a long-term student of emotion, his emotional demeanor has been of great interest to me. And I would say that he has the greatest dynamic range of emotion of any human being I've ever met. Unquestionably. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is he can go from a state where, for example, I've seen this, where a tragedy was described, Tibetan being tortured in a Chinese prison, and he was visibly crying. And then the next moment, he saw something funny and he burst out laughing. Now, that transition from crying to laughter, you often see in very young infants. You almost never see that in an adult. And that's because there's a complete absence of any attachment. It's just pure fluidity. It's context, what we would call context appropriate emotion. And so that to me is really an interesting issue that deserves further study. And the nascent literature on emodiversity would tend to support that. It's in the right direction.
Yeah, great. And I also, oh, sorry. Can I ask my second question, or would you like to move to?
Yes, please, Marika, briefly, and then we can go to Ina.
Yeah, because maybe this
is
maybe this is a very nice lead into the last question I have, which is where I'm kind of curious, Richie, where you hope that this field of contemplative science is going. So would the emodiversity be like the most important thing to go after right now, or what do you think?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think that one of the great things about diversity in general in the world is that different scientists have different kinds of talents. And I think we need to, so I don't think there's a one size fits all prescription. And I think each scientist needs to figure out where she or he can make the most meaningful contribution and really go for it. Having said that, I should also say that for me, I have been having a moral calling that in part is a consequence of this voice that I hear in my mind from His Holiness, where he reminds us that there are 7 billion people on the planet and that suffering is everywhere, and that we need to do everything we can to reach as many people as we can. And so these days, I'm spending more and more of my efforts actually getting out of the laboratory and into the real world and trying to engage in efforts which can promote the widespread dissemination of strategies to cultivate human flourishing. I'm going to give it my all for whatever time I have, because I just, it really is a moral calling. And I feel like humanity depends on some kind of recalibration.
Thank you, Marika, and thank you, Richie. And you refer to experiences of the children or emotions expressed by children. And there's a question related to children here in the chat from Ina Kunath. So Ina, if you want to raise your question, it's brief.
Yes. Hello, I'm really happy to be here and thank you so much for all your work. As I just shortly experienced the tsunami, after that, I just wanted to start helping people as much as I can. And I moved back to Germany and I'm a yoga teacher for children, especially. I do meditation with them, but often it's very hard to get the kids who are very nervous. And I wonder if you done some research on that and what I could do to include it in my work with children.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that question. It's a really important and practical question. And I would say that a couple of things. One, the most important is having really brief periods of practice, really brief. And I mean, like 1 minute, maybe even less than a minute. One of the simple practices that we've done with preschool children, kids 4 and 5 years of age in the US, is to ring a bell and simply instruct them to please listen to the sound. And as soon as you no longer hear the sound, raise your hand. So the sound is audible for maybe 15 or 20 seconds. And during that 15 or 20 seconds, you can feel the kids quieting in this really palpable way. And then they all jump up when they no longer hear the sound. But they can taste the value in that 15 seconds. That's all you need to give them an experiential taste. And then, what we found is the kids actually ask for it when challenging stuff happens. They ask for these practices because they've had one trial learning. They've had one experience, which is enough to teach them that they really can dramatically change their state. Doesn't take much. And that's because one of the things that I've been saying a lot these days is humans are wired to flourish. This is actually part of our biology. It is the direction that we're pointed from the beginning. It's just that we don't nurture it. But it's like one of the other things I often say is when human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And today, virtually every person on the planet brushes their teeth. When you think about it, it's kind of amazing. It's not part of our genome to brush our teeth. It's less connected to our biology than training the mind. And yet we all do it because we recognize it's important for our personal physical hygiene. And I think most people would agree that their minds are even more important than their teeth. So it doesn't take much. It just takes really short amounts. And so I would say start really, really short. And if you start short, virtually every kid could taste the value. And then the second thing is that for kids who are really, really anxious, certain breathing practices to intentionally manipulate the breath, and I'm sure you know these better than I do as a yoga teacher, can be very helpful. Just a few deep breaths to help to directly calm and influence the autonomic nervous system. In work that we've done in adults with PTSD, we found that there are some subgroups that simply can't do any kind of real mind training. Initially, we first have to work with them to calm their bodies. And doing a few simple breathing practices can really help with that.
Mm-hmm. And thank you very much. I have a very short question. You were mentioning that we are, as adults, are looking at our own mind. And what do you think? At what age do you think we could introduce this to children?
Well, I think it can be introduced prenatally. And I'm serious about that. And the reason I say that is that we know that there is now a serious scientific literature on the epigenetic transmission of trauma. Why not epigenetic transmission of awakening? Through the very same mechanisms. And so if you have a pregnant woman who is engaged in these practices, it will actually influence fetal development. And we actually have published serious scientific data showing that the well-being of a mother during the second and third trimester of pregnancy predicts brain wiring that we measure in the baby. When the baby is born, we put the babies in the scanner in the first few weeks of life. And we can predict the wiring in the brain in the first few weeks of life based on the well-being of the mother during the second and third trimesters of pregnancy. So we're now doing research where we're randomly assigning mothers during the second trimester of pregnancy to do mind training. And the primary outcome is not the mother, but it's the fetus.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ina, and thank you, Richie, for the answer. Cheryl Hickman, if you are here, you raised a question in the chat related to another field of human experience, and you can share that yourself if you are here. Maybe I can read it out loud then. What about the idea of Francisco in the research of personal experiences, compassion in hospital or even in the ICU? Any idea of continuation?
Well, it's a great question. And, it's, I think, really important for both healthcare providers as well as for the patients themselves. And, there's more and more interest in the medical community in this. I don't know how it is in Europe these days, but I can tell you in the United States, it's frightening. There, in 2020, which is the last year for which data exists, there was more. So this was the first year of COVID. There was more than one physician suicide a day in the United States. More than one physician suicide a day. It's really a crisis right now with the healthcare profession. And so they are searching for answers. And we've been working with different healthcare systems in both the US, and we're also doing some international work in Mexico to introduce simple programs to cultivate well-being and measuring their impact both on the healthcare providers as well as on the patients they serve. So this is hugely important. And, I think it will, my own view is that it'll affect patient outcomes. And in the end, it will actually improve healthcare delivery and decrease healthcare costs. So it's kind of penny wise and pound foolish not to do this.
Thank you. Ruben Flores, I'm sure you are here. You have an interesting question related to the first person observers.
Yeah, no, thank you, Robert, and thank you to Richie for this very, very interesting talk. And my question is about the Neurophenomenology program. Like, how do you think in terms of, like, how far have we moved in terms of creating spaces for training first-person observers? So I'm thinking if you want to study neuroscience, you can choose many like graduate programs, but if you want to train in first person observation, what do you do? What are the challenges in this regard? That's my question.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. It's a really important one, and I think it goes to the heart of how we design training programs for young scientists in training who are interested and committed to investigating these questions and working in this area. And unfortunately, at least the programs that I know of, mostly in the US, but also in Western Europe, are not particularly receptive to scientists taking the time to engage in training their mind as part of their professional training. Although it really should be, because of all the things we've talked about. So this is really a very challenging problem. And I've, by the way, just to plant a seed, I have suggested that this is actually an important role for Mind and Life, because in the US, the federal government in the US, the NIH has these training grants where they support stipends of young scientists who are in training. But they would never provide funding for a trainee to go on a meditation retreat. But this is where Mind and Life can step in and partner with NIH and say, okay, you provide the funds for the scientific training and we'll provide the funds for the contemplative training. That would be a great partnership. And I think really important. But, we just had a faculty member in our center who went on a 3-month retreat, and he is supported by NIH, and he insisted on telling NIH that he was doing this. And he wanted to make the case that this was absolutely essential for his professional development. And so, I said that, well, if he wanted to do it that way, I'm happy to support him, but I'm also happy to figure out skillful ways around that. But we actually did that. It's the first time that I've ever done that with someone. It was successful. So it may be opening up a new opportunity. I mean, I think this is a guy who is very unusual and who's super productive. And so there weren't, any kind of questions about that. I think everyone was absolutely convinced that he was not going to go off and become a full-time yogi and never return to science. There may be, this may indicate that things are beginning to change a little, but it is a real problem. And for most people, it's going to be a challenge right now.
Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, Richie. We would probably have time for 2 more questions before concluding around 5:30. So I would turn to Annie for a short question and then to Diego, and we will see if we will have time for the question asked by Elaine. So first, Annie, a short question, please.
Yes, well, there's so many breakthroughs. Nevertheless, I feel, well, what have you learned from the depths of knowledge, scientific knowledge in the Tibetans? They are scientifics, not just science of mind, science of body, speech, and mind. And what they know about emotions, I mean, is there a full partnership with a fully qualified High Lama, I would say, yogi, knowing also, not just a practitioner, but somebody knows, having a full partnership. I haven't seen a full partnership between modern cognitive science and what the the knowledge, theoretical and practical knowledge that the Tibetans have. And I think if that happened, it would be really interesting. That's it.
Thank you, Annie.
Yeah, it's a very nice comment. And, it reminds me of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, often going back to and referring to the Nalanda tradition. And I think that what you're calling for is really a resurrection of that tradition, which I wholeheartedly agree with.
Not the Nalanda tradition.
Not the Nalanda.
I'm Nyingmapa, and this is a different tradition. It's a
Yes.
yogic tradition. In the Nyingmapa, there are people you have Kempos, where people who are scholars and practitioners. It's not Nalanda, you see. It's a different connection.
Okay. Well, I'm familiar with your tradition, the Nyingma tradition as well, and I appreciate the emphasis on practice, and certainly wholeheartedly agree that we need that kind of integrated understanding. And I think that we're trying to exemplify how that can be done on a small scale. In our center, we have a very world-renowned Tibetan Buddhist scholar, John Dunn, who is a scholar, particularly of the Vajrayana tradition. And so, he works alongside the scientists, and that's been a terrifically fruitful
I
relationship.
know that, but that's still not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a rare bird. I don't know whether such a rare bird exists, but maybe a team, Okay.
Yeah, I guess I feel like it can be instantiated more realistically in a group, because to realize this in a single person, I agree, is very rare. I think the closest person that comes to that in my mind is Mathieu Ricard.
Well, I know him well, but I'm talking some higher level than Matthew. Well, maybe I'll get in touch with you. I have some ideas.
I think the journey is long and will take centuries, and that science could pick up some little elements of the Buddhist tradition, Tibetan Buddhist tradition so far, is an enormous achievement and a very, very good sign, and sign for hope and sign for further progression. And what we learned from Richie today, that this is just the beginning. And so great discoveries have happened so far, and there's still a lot to achieve, I'm sure. So I think you're right, Annie. We need that, and we need to be patient also to get there one day, hopefully. So I'm turning to Diego now. If you are here, Diego, maybe for the last question, we will see. And thank you, Richie, for your time and presence. Diego first.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Gabor, and particularly hi, Richie. Lovely to see you again. And
great to see you, Diego.
I've been particularly intrigued by what you were saying, the correlation between mental health and actually somatic, let's call it health or somatic experience even. And you alluded that with the example with the children, that actually it's not very helpful to just basically address a mental issue with a mental opposite. You need to basically go into the body. You need to work with the body. So is that bidirectional, or is it sort of monodirectional, that you always have to sort of go through the body, particularly when somebody is aroused or is... and then on the other side, the mental process can obviously also influence, as we all know, the physical somatic experience. So I was hoping you could unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's definitely bidirectional, and there's a lot of really good evidence for that. And there are specific ways in which we have studied that, and other scientists have studied that in a hard-nosed way in the laboratory. Just to give you one specific example, many years ago, this is about almost 20 years ago now, we decided that we really wanted to study these kinds of questions in the context of a real physical disease, which is a major public health issue. And we wanted to find a physical disease for which there was incontrovertible evidence that psychosocial factors play a role in exacerbating the symptoms of that illness, and where there are clear, measurable biological endpoints, and where there's a big socioeconomic disparity in the prevalence of that illness. Now, there are many diseases that can fit the bill there. Of course, there's many. But one that we chose in part because of local considerations, because we recognized that to do this kind of work, we really needed to collaborate with experts in the disease itself. The disease we chose is asthma. And asthma is a huge public health issue. It's got a big socioeconomic gradient. And so we've been doing a bunch of work that is really interesting, including using meditation as an intervention. But what we have discovered is that the mind can influence the lung through the brain and actually produce inflammation in the lung, which causes the proximal symptoms of asthma. And it's also the case that the inflammation in the lung, which we can provoke directly experimentally, can influence the mind and the brain. And so we have rigorously demonstrated that the direction goes both ways. And we've also demonstrated that by training the mind and influencing this one pathway from the mind to the body, we can actually significantly impact, to a clinically significant level, the hard-nosed measures of inflammation and actually gene expression in the lung for genes that are coding inflammatory molecules. And so it's really taken it to a very granular level in being able to demonstrate that.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diego, and thank you, Richie. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank you, Richie, for the whole evening, for the whole sharing of your experience and knowledge, and for everyone, to everyone being here for your questions and engagement and interest. And I think we could continue over the night asking more and more questions, because everything is just so important and so down to earth in our life today, and you have so much to share and so much to promote in terms of knowledge, in terms of attitude, in terms of wisdom, and in terms of compassion and love as well. So thank you, Richie, and we'd like to thank you, Amy, for being a dialogue partner tonight. And I would just like to ask you, Amy, if you want to say a few final words, and you, Richie, as well. And then I would like to give back the floor to Johanna, sharing our upcoming events with you briefly.
Thank you, Gabor, and thank you so much, Richie. While Francisco was alive and after he died, I often thought the words that came into mind with the way he acknowledged and integrated his subjectivity and his personal feelings and life and convictions into his science was fearless. And I always say, you're fearless. And I loved what you said about fear being, love being the antidote to fear. And wanted to thank you for your fearlessness.
Well, thank
all
you.
Your work.
And I want to thank you all so much. And Amy, it's been a blessing in my life to have you as someone I consider a really deep friend. And I really so much honor your commitment to preserving the work of Francisco. And Antoine, it's great to see you and your kids. And before you came on, I was talking about how important you have been to this whole effort. And I love you dearly. And it's just great to see you flourishing in Lyon. And Gabor, it was so wonderful to meet you in person, and thank you for all you're doing for Mind and Life Europe. So, and thank you all for the wonderful questions, and look forward to connecting more often in the future.
Thank you, Richie. We will take your word and we will invite you to come to Europe and our events here in Europe in the future for sure. Thank you so much. Joanna.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we just wanted to very, very briefly mention our 3 upcoming events. So the 3 next Wednesdays, we are going to continue the Francisco and Friends series with another key figure in the history of Mind and Life, both in Europe and in the United States. Adam Engel will be giving a talk next Wednesday called The Secret Sauce of Mind and Life, the Entrepreneur, the Contemplative, and the Academic. So this is again a public talk, similar format as this evening. And you're welcome to sign up and join us, 6 p.m. Central European Time. We have a community of contemplative education talk coming up the following Wednesday, also at 6 p.m. with the Swedish writer and journalist and entrepreneur Anna Borstein. And her talk will be on bringing calm to kids, the Dream of the Good project in Sweden. So we're excited about this. And this is for MLE friends and contemplative education community members specifically. So feel free to join us for that or become an MLE friend. And finally, we have a very exciting talk, a Mind Matters talk, which is a public talk once again with Dr. Barry Curzon, whom many of you may know, a Buddhist monk and physician, notably to the Dalai Lama. And he'll be giving a very provocative talk called No Center, No Edge, Letting Go of a Fixed Identity. And that'll be at 3 p.m. Central European Summertime. So you're welcome to join us for that. And please feel free to spread the word. And thank you so much for everyone for joining us. And thanks again to Richie and Amy. Have a good evening.